I had stood beside Garrick Holt for 19 years, and in all that time I never once saw where he went before the gates opened. We changed together, we marched together, we held the long post at the South Court through summers that baked the cobbles and winters that froze the breath in our chests. I thought I knew the man as well as I knew the weight of my own bearskin. Then, on the last morning of his service, I followed him by accident, and I learned that I had not known him at all. It was the kind of dawn that makes a man go quiet without deciding to. A thin gray light over the Verrill Palace, the lamps along the long wall still burning, the air so still you could hear the flag rope tap against its pole on the far tower. Holt was due to stand his final watch that day. 40 years he had given to the House of Verrill, the last 19 of them at my side, and the regiment had planned a small thing for the evening, a few words, a glass raised, his commission read aloud. He had asked us not to make a fuss. Holt always asked us not to make a fuss. I had come in early to polish my own kit, because a man does not turn up shabby on the day his oldest comrade hangs up his rifle. I crossed the rear yard in the half-dark and saw him ahead of me, already out of quarters, already moving not toward the armory, not toward the parade square, but out through the small east wicket that the gardeners use. He was in his greatcoat with the collar up. He carried something low against his side, cupped in one gloved hand, the way you carry a thing you do not want the wind to take. I should have called out. I meant to. But there was something in the set of his shoulders that stopped the word in my throat, a privacy, a purpose. And instead of hailing him, I found myself following at a distance, my boots quiet on the gravel, telling myself I would only see him to the gate and then turn back. He did not go to the gate. He turned along the old wall, past the kitchen gardens, down the sunken path that runs behind the chapel to the place the palace staff simply call the far corner. I had been there perhaps twice in 19 years. It is a small walled burial ground, older than the present palace, where the house has laid its servants and its soldiers since before anyone living can remember. Moss on the stones, a single yew black against the gray, the kind of place you forget exists until something brings you to it. Holt went through the iron gate without a sound, as though he had oiled the hinge himself, and perhaps he had. He walked a path he plainly knew in the dark, between the leaning markers, to the far wall where the smaller stones stand. And there he stopped. I stayed back by the yew, half hidden, ashamed now of following and unable to leave. He took off his glove. That was the thing that held me, that small, deliberate act. A guardsman's white glove, peeled from the hand finger by finger, tucked into his coat. Then he crouched, slow, his knees not what they had been, and he laid down the thing he had carried. It was a flower, a single flower. In that light I could not tell the color, a pale bloom, one stem, nothing more. He set it at the foot of a low gray stone, squared it the way he squared everything, and then he stayed there on one knee with his bare hand resting flat on the top of the marker, the way you might rest a hand on the shoulder of a man too tired to stand. He said something. I could not hear the words. His breath showed in the cold. Then he rose, drew the glove back on, and stood at attention before that small stone as straight and as still as he had ever stood before the king's own door. He held the salute for the space of 3 long breaths. And then he turned, and I had to step quick behind the yew so he would not see me, and he walked back up the sunken path toward the palace to begin the last day of his career, as though nothing in the world had happened. I stood a long while after he had gone. I am not a man who pries. In our work you learn early that every guardsman carries something he does not show, a grief, an oath, a debt, and you learn not to reach for it. The post teaches you that. You stand for hours beside a man and you share the cold and the boredom and the long minutes of feeling watched by 10,000 strangers, and you come to love him in the plain way soldiers do, and still there are rooms in him you will never enter. I had always assumed Holt's locked rooms were the ordinary ones. A wife lost early, I knew that much. No children. A quiet man who read in the evenings and kept his boots like mirrors and never spoke of the war he had plainly seen. I had never imagined this. I went and looked at the stone after he had gone. I am not proud of it, but I did. The flower lay there pale and exact at the foot of it, and I bent to read the marker in the strengthening light. It gave no name. That stopped me cold. Every other stone in that corner bore a name, a rank, a span of years, servants of the house, guardsmen of old companies, a gardener, a cook, men and women who had given their working lives to Veril and been laid down within its oldest wall. But this one stone, low and gray and worn smoother than the rest by something, bore only a regimental mark I half recognized, and a single line cut beneath it. A soldier of the house, known only to God. No name, no dates. An unknown man, dead longer than I had been alive, laid in the far corner because there was nowhere else and no one to claim him. And Garrick Holt had just knelt to him, and saluted him, and laid a flower at his feet on the last morning of 40 years of service. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a retirement gesture, a man making his peace with the place before he left it. I almost believed it, all through the polishing and the kit check, all through the mustering in the gray yard while the sergeant ran his eye down the line. But then I remembered the flower seller. She has a stall at the corner of the tradesman's lane, old Maven, who has sold to the palace kitchens for 30 years. And I remembered, the way you remember a thing only when it suddenly matters, that I had seen Holt at her stall more mornings than I could count. Early, always early, before anyone else was about. I had thought he bought flowers for his wife's grave in the years after she passed, and had simply never stopped. I had thought it a widower's habit and let it lie. One flower, every morning, for longer than I had served beside him. I did not have the shape of it yet, but I had the edge of something, and it would not let me go, and by the time we marched out to mount the day's first watch I had stopped telling myself it was nothing. That was the morning I began to learn who I had been standing beside for 19 years. My name is Tobias Wren. I was 44 years old that spring, sergeant of the 2nd File, with 22 years in the KingsGuard of the House of Veril, and no particular distinction beyond a steady hand and the trust of the men. I tell you this so you understand that I was no green recruit dazzled by an old soldier's mystery. I had stood through state funerals and a coronation, through a riot at the West Gate and a fire in the old stables. I had buried friends. I did not romance things easily. But I could not let this lie. We held the morning watch under a sky that could not decide on rain. Holt stood his post like a man carved for it, chin level, eyes forward, the rifle a part of his arm, and tourists drifted past us with their cameras, and a small boy stood and stared at Holt for 10 full minutes the way small boys do, willing him to blink. Holt did not blink. He never had. But that day, knowing what I knew, I saw the stillness differently. I had always thought of his composure as a kind of emptiness, the discipline that comes from feeling little. Now I wondered if it was the opposite. I wondered what a man has to hold that still to keep down. I thought back over the 19 years and turned them in a new light. The mornings he was already gone from quarters when I rose. The way he never came drinking with the younger men but never seemed lonely for it. The single odd day each year, I could not have told you the date, but I felt now it must have been the anniversary of the Marl crossing, when he stood his watch with a particular gravity, a weight on him that the rest of us put down to an old soldier's moods. The way, when a funeral cortege passed the gates and we presented arms, Holt held the salute a half-beat longer than the drill required, every time, as though there were always one more man in the procession that only he could see. I had marked all of it and understood none of it. A man can stand at your shoulder for 2 decades, and you can read everything about him except the one thing that matters. At the changing, when we marched off and handed the post to the relief, I walked beside him through the inner court and I nearly asked him. The question sat right behind my teeth. "Garrick, where do you go in the mornings?" But he was looking ahead with that closed, peaceful face, and on the last day of a man's 40 years it felt like a theft to take his quiet from him. So I said nothing, and I made up my mind instead to find the answer some other way, and to leave him his privacy until I understood what I was even asking. I went to Maven's stall at midday, on the excuse of buying something for the evening's table. She is a small woman, brown and folded as a walnut, with hands stained green at the knuckle from 60 years of stems. She knew me by sight. I bought a bunch of something, I do not even recall what, and then I said, as lightly as I could manage, "Sergeant Holt comes to you most mornings, doesn't he, for his flowers?" The old woman's face did a thing I did not expect. It softened, and then it grew careful, the way a face grows careful around a thing it has been trusted with. "He does," she said. "Every morning the Lord sends. Rain or snow, holy days, the morning his own wife was buried, he came that morning too, did you know that? White as the dead himself, and he still came and took his one flower." She looked at me. "You're his friend." 19 years his friend, I said, "and I only learned this morning where the flowers go." She nodded slowly, as if that were the most natural thing in the world, that a man could keep a thing 19 years from the friend at his shoulder. "I never asked him where," she said. "First years I thought a sweetheart or his mother, then his wife passed and I thought that's it, that's the grave. But he kept on after the year of mourning was up, and he never bought two, never bought a wreath, never a posy, one flower, one stem every day. And one day, oh, years ago now, I said to him, 'Sergeant, who's the lucky soul gets a fresh flower every day of his life?' And he looked at me." She paused. "He looked at me a long time. And he said, 'A man I never met. A man who has nobody else.' And then he paid me his coin and went, and I never asked him again, because a thing said like that, you don't poke at it. A man I never met. A man who has nobody else." I stood there in the tradesmen's lane with a useless bunch of flowers in my fist and felt the back of my neck prickle. "How long?" I asked. "How long has he been coming?" Maven looked up at the gray sky as though the years were written on it. "My mother had the stall before me," she said. "She sold to a young guardsman, very upright, very serious, who came for one flower every morning. I took the stall over when she got too old for the cold. That's, 31 years back. He was already coming then, and he never stopped. So." She did the sum the way old people do, with her lips moving. "Near 40 years he's been buying that one flower off this corner. First my mother's hand to his, then mine. 40 years of a single stem, Sergeant, for a man he says he never met. 40 years, the whole of his service. A flower a day for a stranger, every day he wore the uniform, kept so quietly that the friend at his shoulder never knew, and the seller herself never learned the why of it." I thanked her. I do not think I made much sense. I walked back toward the barracks with my mind turning it over and over, and the question had changed shape in my hands. It was no longer where does he go. I knew where. It was who is the man under that nameless stone, and what is he to Garrick Holt, that a guardsman would kneel to him every morning for 40 years and tell no living soul. I had until evening. After the commission was read and the glass was raised, Holt would take off the uniform for the last time, and whatever this was, it would walk out the gate with him, and I would never have it. Some part of me said to let it. It was his to carry. It had been his alone for 4 decades. What right had I to drag it into the light on the very day he laid it down? But I think you know how it is with a thing like that. Once you have seen a man kneel barehanded to a stone that bears no name, you cannot unsee it. And I had begun to feel, I cannot say it better than this, that the not knowing would be a kind of disrespect. That a devotion kept that faithfully, that long, ought not to vanish unwitnessed. That a man who had stood beside me for 19 years deserved, on his last day, for someone to have seen the truest thing he ever did. So I did what a sergeant does when he wants to know the history of a stone. I went to the records hall. The records hall of the House of Verrill is a cold, high room beneath the old library, where the regiment keeps its books going back further than the books in most kingdoms. The clerk there is a man named Pell, dry as the paper he tends, who has spent his life among the dead and prefers them to most of the living. I told him what I wanted. The far corner. The stone with no name, the regimental mark beneath it. He looked at me over his spectacles for a moment, weighing whether a sergeant chasing an old grave on a busy day was a man to be helped or humored, and then he sighed and rose and led me back into the stacks. "The unmarked one," he said. "Not many ask after him. You're the second in my time." "Who was the first?" Pell did not answer. He was already running a finger down the spines of the burial registers, and he pulled one out, fat and water-stained, and laid it on the slope-top desk and turned the stiff pages until he found what he wanted. He turned the book to face me and set his finger on a line. It was an entry from long ago, the ink browned, the hand old-fashioned and cramped. A burial in the far corner. And where the name should have stood there was only a notation, unidentified, recovered after the action at the Marl Crossing, interred with full honors of the house, no effects, no kin traced. "The Marl Crossing," I said. Pell nodded. "Before your time, before mine, near enough. There was a bad winter and a worse bit of fighting at the river crossing out east. The house sent men to hold the bridge while the border folk crossed to safety. They held it, cost them. When it was over they brought the fallen home to be laid down proper, and most had names or papers or a face someone knew. One didn't. Burned past knowing, the old note says, or so far gone in the cold and the water that nothing was left to read. A young man by his frame and nothing else. So the house did the only decent thing. It gave him a soldier's burial in the oldest ground it had, and it cut that line in the stone, known only to God. And then, the way of things, he was forgotten. "The crossing," I said. "How many came over it?" "Hundreds. A whole border town, the records say. Women and old folk and little ones walked out across that bridge in the dark while the company held the far end against what was coming. The histories give it a paragraph. A paragraph for men who stood in a freezing river so that a column of frightened strangers could walk past them to safety, and then went back to holding so the last of them could pass." Pell shook his head. "We honor the named ones every year, the ones whose stones we can read. The ones we can't, we let slip. It's not malice. It's only that a name is a hook to hang a memory on, and a man with no name has nothing for the memory to catch. He just goes." He looked down at the browned entry. "Or he would have, but this one didn't go, did he? Somebody held him." "Not by everyone," I said. Pell looked at me again, longer this time. "No," he said, "not by everyone." He turned more pages, careful, until he reached a thin sheaf tucked into the back of the register, not bound in, but slipped between the leaves, as a man slips a letter into a book he means to come back to. He drew it out and held it a moment as though deciding, and then he handed it to me. It was a request, in the regiment's own form, filed 40 years before. A young guardsman, newly sworn, asking the standing permission of the house to maintain a private grave in the far corner, to tend it at his own expense, to answer for its upkeep so long as he served. The hand was younger, but I knew it at once, the way you know the hand of a man whose duty log you have read beside your own for 19 years. It was Holt's, Garrick Holt, in the first months of his service, asking leave to look after a stranger's grave. And there was a second page, and it was this second page that undid me. It was Holt's letter of explanation, required by the old captain who had granted the request, a captain dead 30 years now, and it was short, the way the truest things are short. I will not give you all of it, because some of it was his and ought to stay his. But the heart of it I can give you, because by the end of that day it belonged to all of us. He wrote that he had grown up in a row of small houses near the eastern border, in a town that the action at the Marl Crossing had saved. He had been a boy of 7 that winter. He wrote that his mother had carried him across the bridge in the dark, with the cold coming up off the river like a living thing, and that there had been soldiers on the bridge holding it open, standing in the freezing water and the worse than water, so that the line of frightened people could pass. He wrote that one of those soldiers, a young man whose face he never clearly saw, had lifted him bodily out of the press when he stumbled and fell, had set him on his feet on the safe side and turned back into it without a word. He remembered 3 things only of that man, he wrote, and he had held them all his life. He remembered that the soldier's hands had been ungloved and blue with the cold, and that they had been strong all the same. He remembered that the soldier had said one thing as he set him down: "Go on, lad. Don't stop. Your mother's just ahead," and then was gone back into the dark, and the cold and the crowd before young Garrick could even turn to thank him. And he remembered that he had looked back once from the safe bank and seen the line of soldiers still standing in the river holding the bridge, and that not one of them was looking back at the people they were saving, because they were all looking the other way, at what was coming. He had been 7 years old, and he had not understood it then. He understood it now, he wrote. He had spent 40 years understanding it. He wrote that he had carried that all his life, that he had joined the house because of it. That when he came to Verrill and learned where the fallen of the Marl crossing lay, he had gone to the far corner and found one stone among them with no name, and had understood, in the plain certain way a man understands the one true thing in his life, that he would never know whether that nameless soldier was the man who had lifted him out of the river. He could not know. The man had no face left to him, no name, nothing. He might be any of the named dead. He might be the one under the blank stone. There was no way ever to be sure. And so, Holt wrote, he had decided to be sure of the only thing he could be sure of, that whoever lay under that stone, with no name and no kin and no one in all the world to remember him, would be remembered, every day, by someone, for as long as that someone drew breath. If he is my soldier, then I have thanked him, the letter ended. If he is not, then I have stood for a man who has no one, in the place of the man I cannot thank. Either way the debt is paid in the only coin I have, which is to come and to remember, and not to let him be alone. I stood in that cold room with the letter shaking very slightly in my hand, and I understood at last what I had watched at dawn. It was not grief. It was not even gratitude, not only that. It was a debt to a man he had never met and would never identify, paid out 1 flower at a time across the entire span of a life, with no audience, no reward, no possibility of thanks, because the man who might have thanked him was dust under a nameless stone. 40 years. A flower a day for a stranger, the most faithful thing I had ever heard of, kept the most quietly. Why was it not known? I asked Pell, and my voice did not come out as steady as I would have liked. A thing like this, the regiment should have honored it years ago. He asked that it not be, Pell said simply. It's in the file. He asked the old captain to keep it to the records and tell no one. Said a debt loses its meaning the moment it's done for praise. The captain wrote a line agreeing, and there it has sat. I've kept the faith with it 40 years, Sergeant, same as he kept faith with the stone. I'd ask you to think hard before you break it. He was right, and I knew he was right. And for a long moment I nearly put the letter back and walked away and let Garrick Holt carry his stranger out the gate that evening exactly as he had carried him in every morning for 40 years, alone and unthanked, and exactly as he wished. But then I thought of the evening, the commission read, the glass raised to 40 years of service, and every man in that room would drink to the Holt they knew, the still one, the silent one, the mirror-booted sergeant who never made a fuss, and not one of them would be drinking to the truest thing the man had ever done. He would walk out of our lives with the whole weight of his quiet honor hidden, and we would salute a stranger and never know it. And I thought, there is a way to honor this without staining it. There is a way that takes nothing from him. I just had to be careful. I had until the muster. I went to our commanding officer. Major Aldrich Venn is a hard man in the best sense, a soldier who came up the way we did and never forgot it, who keeps the old courtesies and despises the new noise. He had served alongside Holt in the early years and respected him the way you respect a wall that has never once leaned. I found him in his office going over the evening's small program, and I closed the door behind me, which a sergeant does not do lightly. I told him everything. The dawn, the flower, the nameless stone, Maven's 40 years of single stems. The file in the records hall, the boy on the bridge, the debt that could never be confirmed and so had been paid every day regardless. I told him the one thing that mattered most, that Holt had asked in writing 40 years ago, that it never be spoken of. The major listened without moving, the way the best of them learned to listen. When I had finished, he sat quiet for a while, his hands flat on the desk. He asked that it not be known, he said at last. It was not a question. It was the weight on the other side of the scale, and he was making me feel it. He did, sir. Then we have a problem, Sergeant. Because what you've brought me is the finest thing I have heard in this regiment in 30 years, and the man it belongs to has forbidden us to speak of it. Yes, sir. He stood and went to the window that looks out over the parade square, where the lamps were being lit against the failing light, and he stood there with his hands behind his back, and I waited, because you do not rush a man like that. A debt loses its meaning the moment it's done for praise, he said, half to himself. He's right, of course. He's entirely right. If we stand him up tonight and read this aloud and make him the hero of the room, we cheapen the very thing we'd be honoring. We turn 40 years of the purest duty I've ever heard of into an after-dinner story. I won't do that to him. He turned. But I won't let it walk out the gate unmarked either. There's a difference between honoring a man and praising him, Wren, and tonight we are going to find it. I did not yet know what he meant, but I had served under him long enough to trust that he did. He gave his orders quietly that afternoon, and they were strange ones, and the men who received them did not understand them and did not ask, because they were good men and the major had asked. A small change to the evening. A few words altered in the program. A thing to be made ready in the far corner before dark, and one instruction to me, the hardest of all: say nothing to Holt. Let him have his last day exactly as he wants it. The honoring is ours to do, the not knowing is his to keep, right up to the moment. The evening came on cold and clear, the first clear sky in days, with a hard bright star or two already out above the long wall. We gathered in the old mess hall, the one with the dark beams and the regimental colors hung along the walls, going back to companies that exist now only as names. 40 or 50 of us in our scarlet, the lamps warm on the brass and the metal ribbons. Holt came in last, as the guest of honor does, and he had that look a man gets on the final evening of a long road, pleased and pained at once, glad of his comrades, and grieving the thing he was about to lay down. He had asked us not to make a fuss, and the major had promised him we wouldn't, and Holt believed it, and there was something in me that ached to watch him believe it. The major read the commission, 40 years of service to the House of Verrill, the posts held, the campaigns, the long unbroken record of a man who had never once been found wanting. It was read plainly, without flourish, the way Holt would have wanted, and Holt stood and received it with his chin level and his eyes a little too bright, and we drank to him, and he thanked us in about 9 words, because 9 words was all he could manage and all he had ever needed. And I thought, that's it then. I thought perhaps the major had decided in the end to keep faith with the file and let the secret go. And I felt the strangest mixture of relief and loss, because part of me had wanted the whole room to know what I knew, and the better part of me had known all along that Holt was right. Then the major set down his glass and said, "Garrick, before you go, there's one last duty I'd ask of you, an old one. It won't take long." Holt looked at him, mild and unsuspecting. "There's a post in the far corner that's wanted standing tonight," the major said. "A grave there. A soldier of the house fell at the Morrow Crossing, never identified. He's been a long time without proper honors. I'd take it kindly if you'd come and help me render them this last evening as one of the oldest serving men of the house. Just the 2 of us and Sergeant Wren. No fuss." I watched Holt's face when the major said the Morrow Crossing. I watched it the way you watch the surface of deep water for the thing moving underneath. It did not break. He had 40 years of practice at not breaking, but something passed behind it, a stillness inside the stillness. And I knew, and the Major knew, that Holt understood in that instant exactly what we had found, and exactly what we were not going to say. For a long moment I thought he would refuse. I thought he would simply say, quietly, that he'd rather not, and that we would have to honor his wish even now and let it all go. He had every right to. But Garrick Holt had never in his life refused a duty asked of him by the House. And whatever else this was, the Major had framed it as a duty, not a tribute to Holt, not a story to be told, but a soldier owed honors and an old hand asked to render them. And that Holt could not refuse. That was the difference the Major had gone looking for, and he had found it. Holt set down his glass. "I'd be glad to, sir," he said. And the three of us went out into the cold and the dark, away from the warm-lit hall, down the sunken path I had followed at dawn, toward the small walled ground and the nameless stone. And behind us, though Holt did not yet know it, the whole of the mess hall rose quietly from the tables and began, in ones and twos in their scarlet without a word to follow. The far corner had been made ready while we ate. That was one of the Major's quiet orders, and when we came through the iron gate I saw what the men had done, and it stopped the breath in me. They had set lamps. Not many, a dozen, no more, the old brass storm lamps from the guardroom, placed low among the leaning stones so that the whole small ground lay in a soft pooled gold against the dark, and the black yew stood over it like a sentry of its own. And before the nameless stone, on a clean square of cut turf, they had laid a single thing, a guardsman's bearskin, set down upright on the grass before the marker, the way a fallen man's helm is set before his grave on the day he is honored. Beside it, nothing else. They had understood somehow, without being told the whole of it, that this was not a grave to be smothered in wreaths. One stone, one honor at a time. They had kept faith with the shape of the thing even without knowing its heart. Holt stopped just inside the gate. He stood looking at it, the lamps, the bearskin, the small gray stone he had tended for 40 years now lit and tended by other hands, and I watched the discipline of a lifetime fight the thing rising under it, and for the first and only time in 19 years I watched Garrick Holt lose. Not loudly. He would never lose loudly, but his jaw worked once, and he closed his eyes for the space of a breath, and when he opened them they were wet and shining in the lamplight, and he did not look away and he did not wipe them, because a guardsman does not, and the tears simply stood there in his eyes and caught the gold of the lamps. "How?" he said, just the one word. It was not anger, it was something closer to fear, the fear of a man whose most private faithfulness has been seen. "Sergeant Wren followed you this morning by accident," the Major said gently, "and brought it to me. Your letter to Captain Maddox is still in the file, Garrick. We read it. We know what you asked and why, and we are going to keep faith with it." He took a step closer. "We are not here to praise you. There'll be no speech, no story told at the bar, nothing that turns your 40 years into a tale. Tomorrow it goes back in the file and stays there. You have my word and the word of every man here." He paused. "But we could not let you carry him out the gate alone, not after 40 years. So tonight, just this once, you don't stand this post by yourself. Tonight the House stands it with you." And Holt turned then at the sound, the soft sound of many boots on the gravel behind him, and saw them coming through the gate. The whole of the regiment in their scarlet, the lamplight on their faces. They came in silence, no order given, and they did not crowd the grave or gawk at it. They formed, the way we form for the colors, in two ranks facing the nameless stone, the way men form for the burial of one of their own. And I understood then what the Major had built, not a tribute to Garrick Holt. A funeral, 40 years late, for the unknown soldier of the Morrow Crossing, the honors the man had been owed since before any of us was born, finally rendered in full, by a full company of the House, in the gold of the storm lamps. And the highest honor in it, the one no one would speak of and everyone in that ground understood, was that we did it because one man had refused for 40 years to let him be forgotten. The Major looked at Holt. "Will you render the honors, Sergeant?" he said. "One last time. He's yours to honor more than any man living." Holt could not speak. He nodded. And then Garrick Holt did, in front of the whole regiment, the thing I had watched him do alone at dawn. And it was the same, exactly the same, and that was what broke every man standing there. He stepped to the stone. He took off his glove finger by finger and tucked it into his tunic. He crouched, slow on his old knees, and he had no flower this time. But a young guardsman in the front rank stepped forward without a word and pressed one into his hand, a single pale stem, and I learned later he had run to Maeve install himself in the dark and roused her and told her only that it was for Sergeant Holt's grave, and she had given it to him and would take no coin. Holt looked at the flower in his bare hand for a moment. Then he laid it at the foot of the stone and squared it, and rested his bare palm flat on the cold marker the way you rest a hand on a tired man's shoulder. And this time, with all of us there, he spoke loud enough to be heard, not a speech. Just the thing he must have said every morning for 40 years, the thing none of us had ever heard. "Still here," he said to the stone. "Still here, friend, I told you I'd come." Then he rose and drew his glove back on, and came to attention before that nameless grave as straight as he had ever stood in his life, and he saluted. And 40 men in scarlet saluted with him. We held it. We held it a long time, longer than any drill, longer than any state occasion, the lamps burning low and steady, and the cold coming up off the old ground and not one man moving, all of us at the salute before a stone that bore no name, a soldier of the house. Known only to God, honoring at last the man Garrick Holt had refused to let the world forget, and honoring, without a word of it spoken, Garrick Holt himself. He left the next morning. He took the early walk one final time, alone, the way it was always meant to be, and laid his last flower as a private man and not a guardsman, and then he went out the small east wicket and did not look back, and that was right. But the post did not go empty. The major saw to it before Holt was a day gone, a standing duty of the house, entered in the order book and read at muster like any other, that the grave of the unknown soldier in the far corner be tended every morning with a single flower by a man of the regiment in turn, forever. Maven's stall has a standing order on it now. The young guardsman who ran for the flower in the dark took the first morning and asked for it. There is no shortage of volunteers. The men do not speak of why much. They do not need to. They know it was Holt's, and they know what it was, and they have decided among themselves, in the plain way soldiers decide such things, that a debt that faithful is not the kind you let die with the man who paid it. I have stood that dawn watch myself more than once. I take my flower from Maven, and I walk down the sunken path in the gray light, and I take off my glove finger by finger, and I lay the stem at the foot of the stone, and I rest my bare hand on the cold marker, and I say the thing Garrick Holt said. I did not know him for 19 years. I learned that on his last morning. But I know now the truest thing about him, and it is the truest thing I know about this uniform, and it is this, that the deepest discipline is not standing still while the world tries to move you. It is standing faithful to a thing that will never thank you, every single day with no one watching, and then, when at last you are seen, kneeling to it all the same. A flower a day, for a stranger for 40 years. I think of it every morning I lay mine down, and I do not let him be alone.